Yeah, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for connecting. I'm delighted to return as a guest speaker for a meeting of the Cobourg District Historical Society in a virtual sense this time, of course. Certainly, I'd rather be standing in front of you, but Zoom works well, and we're getting handy with this approach to having meetings. In any case, thanks very much for this opportunity. The title of my presentation, as you've seen, The Wreck of the HMS Speedy, the making of a history book. This talk will be much different than most that I give on the Speedy story, because I feel I don't need to tell this group the basic story of the Speedy. Instead, my objective is to provide some insight into how this book was created. I'll talk about the research that went into the historical part of the story, and also look at some of the documents related to the search for the remains of the Speedy that happened there in the early 1990s. In the end, I'll summarize where we are today with that and what I think needs to be done. The story of HMS Speedy can be called the low-hanging fruit for the media industry. Before writing the book, I conducted a survey of accounts of the story and found more than 55 individual identifiable items. Most of these were newspaper and magazine articles, but a few were from historians or journalists who specialized in history stories. The earliest account of the story, the Speedy, was this article that appeared in the Upper Canada Gazette on November 3rd, 1804, less than a month after the Speedy was lost. Now, this has been used as a basic source by many historians, and it's very useful as far as it goes. The writer, John Bennett, editor of the Gazette, had no knowledge about what happened to the Speedy, no more than anybody else, except that the general idea it was lost in a terrible storm. So most of this article deals with the people who were on board the Speedy. And that's sensible because York at that time, 450 people, pretty much everybody in town knew somebody who was on the ship. Well, certainly this article is very helpful for those of us 2 centuries later who are trying to tell the story. The most well-known account of the Speedy story is from C.H.J. Snyder. He was a career journalist with the Toronto Telegram, and he wrote a column called Schooner Days in the 1930s and 40s. Frankly, I discounted his version immediately on reading the full text. Clearly, Snyder was in the business of selling newspapers. His column was very popular due to his skill in creating tales of daring do on the high seas. Oh, but don't listen to me. Here's an introduction to the text of Snyder's story written by an official at Presqu'île Provincial Park in 1977. It says in brackets at the top of the story, the following account of C.H.J. Snyder includes the known historical facts of the Speedy disaster, but also adds the imaginative embellishment that is helpful in interpretive presentations of park histories. Many of the recorded conversations are imaginative, but not on that account unimportant. Snyder is following the old ploy in telling of history. It was first used by Thucydides, that of casting the principal personages and outering their attitudes and situations by means of dialogue. Snyder's is certainly the most exhaustive account of the incident on record, and it gives this important event the human interest and enhanced dimension, which a bare bones factual account might not. Well, I tend to agree. And that's why when I read Snyder's account, I put it away and really didn't go back to it. The only full-size book that's written on the Speedy story before my book came out in 2020 was called Speedy Justice, The Tragic Last Voyage of His Majesty's Vessel Speedy. This book was written by Brendan O'Brien and was published in 1992. Mr. O'Brien was a very accomplished lawyer in Toronto, and he was president of the Osgood Society. This book was released just as Ed Burt, the professional diver in Belleville, was winding up his last diving season in search of the remains of the Speedy, so in the fall of 1992. I learned the hard way that if you mentioned this book to Ed Burt, he would get red-faced and start to curse. Well, he simply saw this book as an attempt to horn in on his story. However, O'Brien, of course, he knew nothing about the search for the Speedy that Ed was doing since it was done in secrecy. On the other hand, I found speedy justice to be extremely useful in understanding the legal history of Upper Canada in those days, and explains very well how this story was impacted by the forces at play in government and society at the time. The research was excellent, and I was directed to many important documents through this book. Now, in the end, I did not quote directly from this book very often. It is always my preference to go back to the original documents and to tell the story I see from there. All historians and authors have their own point of view and orientation and priorities. I feel it's important to strongly support your own sensibilities in situations like this. One of the most obvious accounts of the Speedy story is included in Landmarks of Toronto, Volume 1, page 319. It's included in a section about the history of the courthouses of York. Landmarks of Toronto is a huge collection of history assembled and published by J. Ross Robertson of the Toronto Telegram in the 1890s and the early 1900s. However, when you look closely, you see that he simply took the information about the Speedy story from another respected local historian who had written about it earlier, Dr. Henry Scadding. Now, the bio of Henry Scadding says he was a teacher, an Anglican clergyman, and historian. The collection of his writings in Toronto of old are about early York and Toronto history. The details are extensive and fascinating, and the presentation is entertaining. It's one of those documents that I just can't put down. However, his bio provides a word of caution. It says, Toronto of old should be used cautiously for fact. With access to many more primary sources than Scadding had, historians now know that he could occasionally be wrong. Then it says, the real value of the book lies in Scadding's ability to revitalize the minute past. All historians might aspire to that sentiment. However, we need to be very careful in using information from documents like this. In fact, it appears in the case of the Speedy story that Scadding took information from an even earlier source. The oldest source that I found for the Speedy story, outside of the 1804 newspaper report, was the obituary of Moody Farewell. Now, if we recall the story, we know that William and Moody Farewell were managing the fur trading post on Lake Scugog when they found John Sharp murdered. Moody Farewell was also one of two witnesses, along with Eleazar Lockwood, who were paddling their canoe to Newcastle when the Speedy was lost. The obituary of Moody Farewell appeared in the Oshawa Vindicator newspaper on December 8th, 1869. It was a long two-page article that included extensive information about Farewell family history. But there's a problem. The microfilm version of the pages of the newspaper that contain the article show large blank spaces where the text used to be. This is a snip of the header of that first page, and you can see that there's a blank space on the right side, and that somebody has written the date of the issue, December 8th, 1869, at the top, because the date was in the part that's cut off. The second page is almost totally blank, except for the name Moody Farewell written across the top of the page. It looks like someone cut the article out of the newspaper that was when it was in their own collection, and then probably many years later, passed their collection on for archiving in microfilm. You could have had, at the microfilm that day, you could have heard me say a little more than drat. Well, looking further, I found the death notice that appeared in the paper a week earlier. And it says very specifically, we intend to give such a sketch next week, meaning the full biographical sketch of Mr. Farewell. Of course, we don't have that article, but all is not lost. It turns out that another historian copied the text of the obituary and printed most of it in his own collection of work. That was Samuel Peder of Oshawa. He collected historical information which has been over the years assembled and published. It normally is called the Samuel Peder manuscript. Confirmation of my theory about the obituary is given in frame 179, just before the section about farewell family history. It says, the following is compiled from an article which appeared in the Oshawa Vindicator on the 6th of December, 1869. An obituary article, supposed to have been from the pen of the late Abram Farewell, MPP, on the occasion of the decease of his father, Moody Farewell. And coming from such a source, the information contained therein may be relied upon as accurate. Well, aside from the date being a little bit off, I tend to agree. So this process satisfied my need to go back to the oldest documents I could find about the story. In this case, we have access to the obituary of a person who participated in the events of 1804. At the same time, of course, we have to remember that this account is oriented from the point of view of the Farewell family. Here we see a description of the events that occurred after the murder of John Sharp at the Farewell trading post and leading up to the arrest of Akatanaka. It says, the Indians and their chief all left Lake Scugog and came down their trails to the Annis Creek, the mouth of it, now Port Oshawa, with their canoes on their shoulders. And from this place, they went in a body up the lake close to shore to York. Mr. Moody Farewell followed. And upon complaint being made, a guard of soldiers crossed over to the point on the island to arrest the murderer. The chief took the culprit by the shoulder and led him forward. Now, one might view this as speculation or a bit of embellishment, but to me, there's enough specific detail given here to suggest that it came from someone who actually either participated in the event or recalled the events in their own lifetime. Considering the source and the language, my view is that this is as close as we will ever get to the facts of this part of the story. Another thing, since the book came out in August of 2020, I've had several questions from people of why I did not include that popular story about the Farewell brothers in the book. The story that suggests that William and Moody Farewell planned to board the Speedy near their home, and then when they saw the condition of the ship, they refused to board and decided to take a canoe. Well, this is a fun story, of course, but it does not match with the documentation we have. It's very simply, this is not what happened. And here's one good example where, we need to tell our history stories based on documents to the greatest degree possible and not on local lore. And this piece from Samuel Peder manuscript tells us what happened regarding to this and a few other matters. Business prevented Moody Farewell from going to York to join the party there. He and Lockwood were to proceed to Wellers from the Annis Creek in a canoe. The vessel sailed from York in the morning on the month of September 1803. At sunset, Farewell and Lockwood camped a few miles below Cobourg, the vessel being seen by them on the lake several miles offshore. During the night, a fearful storm arose, and not one of the souls on the vessel was left to tell the particulars of this catastrophe. Well, first, of course, this confirms that Moody Farewell and Eleazar Lockwood were planning to testify as witnesses at the trial, and not Moody and William Farewell. The term Wellers, I see this occasionally in that early time frame. Folks who lived to the west of this territory knew very well who Asa Weller was down at Carrying Place. So they tended to use that name to indicate anything in the general area. Obviously, the month and the year are wrong in this text. Of course, we know that dates are the first thing to go when stories get retold down decades and even generations. More important to me was that this is the only account of the Speedy story where it mentions that Moody Farewell actually saw the Speedy out in the lake as it sailed toward Newcastle. To me, this was critical because it puts the ship in a time, in a place. One source I used a lot to learn about the ship itself and the operations of the Provincial Marine was the British Military and Naval Records. These are found in the website of the Library and Archives of Canada. I downloaded literally hundreds of documents from this site. And they include lots of letters between Kingston, Quebec, and York regarding the building and the maintenance of the ships, as well as things like disciplining of the crews and the sailors who worked for the Provincial Marine. An important example is this letter reporting the launch of the Speedy, dated September 6, 1798. It was written by Major Hazelton Spencer, who was commander at Kingston, to Major James Green, military secretary to Lord Dorchester in Quebec. The letter opens with the report. The gunboat Speedy is launched and equipped and sailed for Fort George under the command of Lieutenant Thomas Paxton. There are also lots of mundane reports about maintenance problems, such as this letter from Kingston to York on November 7th, 1803. It says, Captain Steele acquaints me that the very leaky state the Speedy is in at present will prevent her from making another trip this season without being previously repaired. There are literally dozens of letters of this type about the Speedy and many others. It was very common. This was a chronic problem in the Provincial Marine, and they just handled it as daily routine procedure. More profound items are reported as well. On October 25th, 1804, more than 3 weeks after the Speedy set sail, Lieutenant Colonel John Vincent, commander at Fort George, there at the mouth of the Niagara River, sent this letter to York confirming that items from the ship had been found on the south shore of Lake Ontario, about 40 miles east of Fort George. He writes, I feel much regret. I have it not in my power to remove the general's alarm for the fate of the Speedy. On Friday last, an account came here that a boat had broken up. A topmast, a binnacle, mast, and hencoop painted red with some spars. These articles were taken on shore near the oak orchard to a Mr. Fuller, about 40 miles from here, to which place we send Indians for information who are not yet returned. But I am sorry to state that a Mr. McDonald has just arrived from that place who reports that he saw their articles at Mr. Fuller's and that the name of Paxton was on the lantern of the binnacle. This news confirmed what everyone feared and sent the town of York and the communities around Upper Canada into mourning. Now let's fast forward to the modern era. In the fall of 2018, I received a phone call. It was from a lady in Belleville who had been for more than 2 decades the partner and companion of Mr. Ed Burt, the professional diver in Belleville, who had conducted the underwater survey work looking for the Speedy in the early 1990s. Sadly, Ed had passed away in the fall of 2017, and a year later, his companion was ready to move on. A few hours after the phone call, this box of documents ended up on my table. When I speculated about how long it would take to process all of these documents, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Oh, you keep them." Well, I knew at that moment that my next book would be about the Speedy. I had worked with Ed in his HMS Speedy Foundation from 2012 to 2017, doing promotional work and some speaking engagements. We had talked about doing a book, but I would not agree to the type of book that Ed wanted to do, so the idea was shelved. Now, in the last few years, the other members of the group kind of faded away, but I was the only one of the group to stay in touch with Ed. In fact, he relied on my computer skills to support speaking engagements since he had no capability in that area. Over several years, and after much very intense back and forth between us, I was able to smooth out his presentations a bit. At one point, I threatened to stop helping him if he did not tone down his language. Well, he thought it was cute, but I did not want my name associated with such negativity. Well, over time, he did improve. And if it wasn't for the health problems he had in the last few years, I expect we would have had more speaking engagements. I had often thought that the historical part of the Speedy story was obvious material for a book. However, I felt very strongly that it would be very incomplete if it did not include information about the search about the remains of the Speedy. So now that I had Ed's papers sitting in front of me, it was time for me to do that book. Well, Ed Burt's collection includes a lot of different kinds of documents. For instance, there's the annual project reports that he had to create. The most important one, of course, was the first one for the 1990 season, which we see here on the left. And on the right is the last major report called the project report for 1997. These annual reports were required by the terms of his archaeology survey license, which were issued each year. In fact, Ed was negligent in his reporting. The Ontario Ministry required these reports in order to provide information about the survey work that was going on at archaeology sites each year. They were supposed to contain details about current survey work, but they could also contain information about the historical background of the ship in question. After the first report, which was done by a professional marine archaeologist, I expect that the folks at the ministry learned to ignore Ed's reports, since they were designed mostly to promote his version of the Speedy's demise rather than assist in upgrading the archaeology record. And particularly, they may have responded that way to the largest of the annual reports that I found in Ed Burt's collection, the one called the HMS Speedy Project Report for 1997. As we can see, this report was created in March of 2005. It contained 120 pages filled with complex technical detail and maps and charts and pictures. It was done in response to a threat from the ministry that Ed would be denied any more new licenses for the site if he did not at least attempt to bring his reporting into compliance. Ed hated doing the type of reports the ministry wanted, so he decided to do one the way he wanted. He'd been itching for a long time to tell the story of what he believed had happened to the Speedy. And now it was a story that was informed by all of his knowledge and experience after 3 years of underwater survey work. Here's the most important page from that 1997 project report. It's a nautical chart showing the estimated route that the Speedy may have taken. It's highlighted in the dark blue line. As Ed told the story in this report, the Speedy was sailing from the west, pushed by a strong westerly storm, and at night, Captain Paxson was not able to make the turn into Presqu'île Bay. The Speedy was blown off to the east into Wellers Bay. Now, in 1804, there weren't nearly the sand spits that we see there today blocking Wellers Bay. Well, Captain Paxson would have been happy to ride out the storm in Wellers Bay and a couple of days later, sail over into Presqu'île Bay. However, this is when his luck ran out, because this is when the nor'easter hit the area. We know these storms, they happen in the fall, they come out of northern Quebec and they blast down across the Great Lakes in a northeast to southwest direction. This was a vicious storm. And the effect it had was that it blew the Speedy back out into Lake Ontario. The dramatic climax of the story comes when the Speedy collides with a large rock that was just a few inches below the surface of the water, right there on that shallowest point of the formation called Dobbs Bank. This was a violent collision. The hull cracked like an egg, the decking split apart in seconds, the mast toppled over, and along with the people and the baggage, everything ended up in the raging lake waters. The 20 souls on board would have died either in the collision or in a few seconds as the ship disintegrated around them. And then, as that nor'easter continued to howl, many items from the ship would gradually sink down into the water and find a resting place over Dobbs Bank. Larger items that would float would be blown off to the north-southwest out into Lake Ontario. This is what Ed Burt believed happened to the Speedy. He believed it in 2005 when he wrote this report, and he would believe it until the day he died in 2017. Ed knew very well what he had seen on the ground over Dobbs Bank during his survey work. And he believed that he needed to provide a compelling and dramatic story that would explain how every piece of the ship could end up in that place and in that condition, as he saw during his survey work. On the other hand, we might call it reverse engineering. Another very important item in the collection is this VHS tape. Remember, it's the early 1990s. Now, in 2019, I was able to have the material on this tape converted to digital. And I found that it contained the video from the summer of 1989, which Ed took over Dobbs Bank while testing a new model of underwater video camera. Now, as the label suggests, it also contains several segments of divers exploring various shipwrecks, which has nothing at all to do with the Speedy. The testing video was a major factor that motivated Ed Burt to search for the remains of the Speedy over Dobbs Bank. However, the quality is very poor in most of the tape due to the low resolution of the original underwater video camera in 1989 and the very poor visibility in the water over Dobbs Bank. In spite of this, the video has already proven to be very effective in supporting the documentation about Ed's survey work. My experience suggests that people who have knowledge and experience in this area want to see a live video, regardless of the quality. These two binders are found in Ed's collection. The black binder on the right contains a lot of documents, historical documents about the story of the Speedy, as well as the story of Newcastle and what happened there, and many accounts and different accounts written by local historians. The green binder contains all the survey sheets and associated nautical charts that Ed created during the 3 summers of survey work. Regulations under the Ontario Ministry governing marine archaeology sites stipulate that survey sheets and some other documents cannot be published or shared with the public because they contain the coordinates revealing the exact locations of underwater artifacts. The ministry always tries to protect marine sites from theft and damage by careless divers or treasure seekers. And I've willingly complied with their wishes, both in the book and the videos and in my speaking engagements. Oh, by the way, the ministry that controls this is called the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and Culture Industries. Quite a mouthful. Well, at least that's what it's called this week. In my research, I found that the name of this ministry has changed numerous times since Ed began doing his work in the early 1990s. Anything to make it more difficult for us to do research. The collection also includes copies of the actual archaeology survey licenses that Ed obtained for the Speedy site. The details of these documents help us understand not only what happened at an official level, but to make some sense of the ultimate failure of Ed's project to continue after he found artifacts. Now, the first license for 1990 was applied for and given to a professional marine archaeologist. And as a result, that first license, the most important clause in the license reads, the licensee agrees to retrieve only a limited number of artifacts sufficient to establishing full and proper identification of the wreck. Well, in fact, this clause was never used because they only found artifacts in the last 2 diving days in October. So they had no opportunity to bringing anything out of the water. Then in the spring of 1991, the professional marine archaeologist decided not to return to the Speedy story. He felt that he hadn't seen anything to indicate that it was the Speedy they were dealing with. Yes, they'd found artifacts in the previous fall, which meant they should continue. And if they found something to help identify it as the Speedy, he would be glad to come back and help them with it. But in the meantime, he had major projects that needed his attention. As a result, the survey license for the 1991 season was applied for and given to Ed Burt, who was not a professional marine archaeologist. And as a result, the pertinent clause in that license read, retrieval of artifacts from underwater sites is not covered under this license. In effect, they could not retrieve any artifacts under any conditions. Later licenses would begin to use terms like do not disturb, which meant total hands off everything they found. Well, this situation was very annoying for Ed Burt, because now they'd actually found artifacts. They couldn't bring them up to help identify the wreck as the Speedy. And if they couldn't even begin to identify the wreck as the Speedy, then the professional marine archaeologists weren't going to be interested in participating in the project. And if the professionals weren't engaged in the project, it was less likely they'd be able to identify the wreck as the Speedy. It was a classic catch-22 situation. Unfortunately, Ed Burt's collection contains very few pictures of the actual survey work. Here's one exception. This was taken on July 26, 1990, during the first season of diving. This shows Glen Rover, the boat that was used for the survey work in that season. And there's Ed sitting on Avon, the inflatable raft that was used as a diving platform. Here's another rare exception. This is showing Terry Coons with a scorching sunburn. And there's Ed's shoulder. They're on Avon again there. Terry Coons was the chief diver in Ed's crew. He was a very experienced diver and gained most of his training from the US Navy. I was really lucky to be able to spend several hours with Terry talking about his work with Ed in the Speedy project. In fact, it really turned out that this fella, Terry Coons, is far more forthright and credible than Ed Burt could ever be. Oh, in the foreground here, you see this, the Proton 2, that's a marine magnetometer. That's an example of the kind of expensive and complex equipment that Ed had to use to do underwater survey work like this. And he had access to this kind of equipment because his company, Ocean Scan Systems, was an agent in Canada for fishers in Florida. You know, Mel Fisher, the guy who found Atosha, the richest shipwreck in the world. Ed was very much plugged into that world. And of course, here he is with his favorite, the Sea Otter, very popular remotely operated underwater video camera. He certainly put this equipment through its paces during those 3 years of survey work in the summers of 1990, 91, and 92. During the 3 summers of survey work, Ed and his crew did not find a shipwreck in the conventional sense, you know, like we see in National Geographic or recreational diver magazines. No, what they found was a very large debris field, covering several square kilometers. This image, which came from the 1989 video, created quite a buzz in the archaeology community early in the Speedy project. Here we see a pair of spectacles, a clay pipe, and right here is one of those long, thin, square black glass bottles, usually held ginger beer, which was the favorite for the sailors, and that one still has the cork in place. Oh, and there is a cannonball as well. The archaeologists felt that even with this foggy picture and just a visual, they could begin to tentatively date all of these items to the very early 1800s, which would suggest an unusually old shipwreck for Lake Ontario. Arguably, the most important artifact that they located was this small cannon. This appeared in the 1989 video. It's one of the things that really excited Ed a lot. This is called a carronade. You can see the outline of it here. This would be very typical of the small cannon that would be installed bow and stern of small British gunboats in that era. Terry Coons, the chief diver, said he stood over this, and he said what interested him was this round raised area on the top here. He said it was like a crest or a coat of arms. He thought there might be identifying information there, but it was covered in very thick moss and sand. And do not disturb was in order, so he did not scrape the moss off the crest. Well, where there's cannons, there must be cannonballs. And here are only 4 of the numerous cannonballs that were identified across the large debris field. Terry Coons also stood over what he thought might be the ship's bell. He said, well, certainly it is a ship's bell. You can tell when you get close to it, it's lying on its side beside some rocks, and it's covered in very thick moss. Terry Coons told me, he said, one time he stood over this and he thought, it would be such a quick job to pull out my knife and scrape the moss off the bell and see if the name HMS Speedy is there on the side of the bell. Now, I don't know if it was the habit of the Provincial Marine at that time to put the name of the ship on the bell. Certainly we identify that as a later habit in time, but it's a fascinating idea. However, Terry Coons knew very well that if word of that kind of activity got back to the Ontario Ministry that manages marine archaeology sites, that Ed's license and the entire project would be in jeopardy. So he didn't scrape the moss off the bell. This image shows what Ed thought were planks from the decking of a ship. Now, I talked to Terry Coons about this to some degree, and he said, well, you had to be very careful. And they learned this, that something like this could look like planks and decking, but when you got close, it could be a limestone shelf, which is very common in this area. So you had to be very careful. But Ed was also very interested in all the shiny objects that were on the ground around there. And in the survey sheets, you see the word shiny object many times. Ed believed that these shiny objects were buttons from the coats of the officers of the Provincial Marine, maybe even Captain Paxton. Well, I did some research on the Provincial Marine, and in talking about their uniforms, they said that they had large yellow buttons with the figure of a beaver over which is inscribed the word Canada. Wouldn't it be cool to see if some of these shiny objects down there are actually that kind of button? One of the most interesting items that they found was seen in the 1989 video was this chest sitting right there flat on the ground. Now, Ed speculated that this chest might contain the 6 copies of the Statutes of Upper Canada, which we know by documentation was on board the Speedy, was being sent to the magistrates in Newcastle district. Well, this is just the kind of thing Ed liked to talk up, and he would exaggerate. Who knows if there's anything in this chest? But again, it would be really neat to find out. Some of the most easily identified items were the masts. Speedy was a twin mast schooner. Now, the divers initially thought these were just logs, but when they looked closer, they saw that there were 2 of them. They were lying close together. And when they looked even more closely, they saw they were manufactured. You can see there's tapering at one end. And the specs of these items match very well with documentation we have from the Point Frederick shipyard in Kingston at that time. Well, there's a whole lot of other items that were identified in Ed's survey sheets that we won't take time for tonight. To change the subject, how about a word about publishing? I was really lucky to have an expert publishing consultant who was also a good friend. Here on the right is Beth Bruder. We were there at the Codrington Farmers Market soon after the book was launched. Beth was recently retired as vice president with Dundurn Press in Toronto. In the spring of 2019, I showed her the manuscript as it was at that point. She became very enthused and agreed to come on board as a publishing consultant. She interfaced with the publishing world, so I didn't have to, which was great for me. Over several months, Beth contacted publishers and found that none of the major players were interested in a history book. Now, to be fair, it could also be because the manuscript itself was not fully developed at this time. So Beth set me up with a small publisher in Georgetown, people she'd worked with, actually people she had trained in the publishing industry decades before. She also found an editor to do what they called a developmental edit. I had never experienced such a thing, and I was not prepared for how jarring this would be. However, as we got into it, I started to see what they were getting at. Now, the original idea for this book was that it be designed for the commercial market, and just not for history buffs alone. We felt that this story was important enough to deserve a wider audience. And I can clearly say that the developmental edit created this commercial book. Much of the history detail that I love so much was edited out, and I had to find alternative means for providing that material to the public. I decided to use appendices in the book, as well as to get in the business of videos and to make a lot more use of my website. In the end, my fellow history buffs can find much more information that's in the book itself, and that makes me happy. One set of information that was edited out of the book early in the process was the detail about the 3 seasons of survey work. Well, I was not happy about this at first, but I was able to roll with the situation. I decided to present this information in an appendix at the back of the book. This way, the editors were happy because the story moves along briskly, and I was happy because I could ensure that the readers who are interested can find this important information in the book. Appendix A, as shown here, contains a timeline of the events of the Speedy project, including the steps to prepare for the survey work, the daily activity that was reported in Ed's survey sheets, and the subsequent events after the diving was over. If we want to understand what Ed Burt actually did, I believe it is important to see how the project developed over time. A word about the image on the front cover of the book. Here is the artwork of Pete Rindlisbacher, which shows the Speedy foundering east of Presqu'île. Oh, and you'll notice this little spot of light. That's meant to represent the beacon fire that would have been built by George Gibson and Charles Selleck to help Captain Paxton come into Presqu'île Bay. Well, as you can see, this is a dramatic and even frightening portrayal of the peril the Speedy was in at that night. And it's presented to us through the eye of an accomplished artist. Pete was delighted to have his artwork on the front of the book. And I know for sure that it makes this book even more attractive, both on a bookshelf and on a website. So thank you very much, Peder. After all of this, where do we stand today? First, very few people are willing to believe that there are artifacts from a very old shipwreck on Dobbs Bank. Ed's abrasive character and old school methods caused the archaeologists to reject everything he did. And the conventional wisdom of today is that he found nothing. On the other hand, the Ed Burt collection demonstrates clearly that there are artifacts from a very old shipwreck on Dobbs Bank. We don't know if they're from the Speedy or not, but Ed's work provides significant evidence to suggest that it may be possible. Well, now that this information is public in the form of a book, the professional marine archaeologists must get to work. The professionals must bring their boat out over Dobbs Bank. With all their new fancy electronic communications and radar and camera equipment, imagine how much better underwater color video cameras are today than in the early 1990s. They must also bring Ed's survey sheets so they can use those coordinates he recorded to find the masts and the chest and the clay pipe and the cannon to see if they can locate those items again. Without the direct engagement of the professionals, the mystery will remain. Well, the book was released on August 18th, 2020, and it's been distributed nationally. I can't suppress a grin when I say that Indigo loved this book from the beginning, probably because it was designed as a commercial book. So that's the reason, their commitment was the reason that we were able to get the book out during the pandemic. So it's widely available, and there's an ebook. And of course, please support your local bookstore. My folks here in Brighton, the Lighthouse Books, have done a great job. Let's Talk folks in Cobourg done a great job. They have copies. Right now, I'm getting ready to start the farmers market season as my only option for direct sales, actually starting this Sunday up at Codrington Farmers Market. And I hope to make it to the Cobourg market sometime this year as well. Well, if you'd like more information about this story and my other work, please go to my website, danbuchananhistoryguy.com. And I'll highlight two things there. First, I've created a 5-part video series that basically mirrors the book. Of course, in video, you can use a lot more imagery. The links to those images, those videos are there on the videos webs page in my website and on my YouTube channel as well. There's also a section called Extra Info. I like to say that this is from one history geek to another. This is web pages and some downloadable PDF files that contain detailed research for issues that are kind of peripheral to the Speedy story that I had to cover in order to understand the issues around it, and that didn't make it into the book. So feel free to help yourself to all of that material and pass it around. Well, thanks so much for your attention, folks. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you very much.